All right. Well, thanks for being here. Can the folks on the computer hear me okay? Great. All right. We'll get started then. I appreciate the opportunity to come and present on this project that we're working on, and kind of tell you how we're trying to impact the industry on a pretty large scale when you think about it with transmission. That's kind of, as we talk, part of this presentation is to explain how transmission has been one of the major limiting factors towards expanding the wind industry. And so that's what our company is about. I work for a company called Clean Line Energy Partners, and we are an independent transmission development company. So we are simply the folks that are trying to connect the resource to the demand. We were founded in 2009. A lot of us came from the wind development business. So I developed wind farms in Kansas, and a number of our folks were from that industry as well. And it didn't take us long before we realized that allowing the wind industry to reach its full potential was going to be limited by the lack of transmission. And so we formed this company to try and solve that problem. We are currently have two main investors. One of them is National Grid. That's a utility out of the Northeast. Their headquarters are actually in Great Britain, and together they're probably one of the top 5 in size utilities in the world. So they, really understand what we're doing. Provided us with a good investment partner to help do what we're trying to do. And then ZBI is another investment company that has a lot of investments in energy projects. So basically what's been happening is the improvement in wind turbine technology over time, which you all are probably very familiar with, has led to more efficient, more cost-effective generation of energy from wind. It used to be the saying that wind is great, but it's too expensive. It's not cheap enough. But now, and I'll show you here, we've really gotten to grid parity with the cost, and that's largely due to the technology improvements, the efficiencies, and most of that comes from scaling up the wind turbines themselves. Larger rotor swept area, higher hub heights, all allow you obviously to capture more wind energy and convert it to electricity. So this graph is kind of busy, but what it shows you is a historic movement of wind projects over time. So each one of these circles represents a price. So the higher up the circle is, the higher the cost, and this is time. And the black line shows an aggregate cost of wind energy over time. You may not be able to pick this up over the internet, but the darker filled-in circles represent projects out in California, where the wind resource, I see the wind resource maps up on the back wall, so you guys know all about that. Really what this illustrates is cost of wind is correlated to wind speed. So all the projects that have been developed over time along the bottom are from the wind belt. That purple, what we call the purple wind, you have it on your map. That's the best wind in the country, right up and down, from North Dakota to Texas. Those are the cheapest of these projects. So in this $20 to $40 range, and that price continues to come down. That's kind of bump spike you see there. That was simply related to more demand than supply in the around 2008. It was really the cost came down. There was not the supply chain to meet the demand, so turbines were scarce, and the cost went up for a while until the industry responded. And now, what's not really reflected on here, you're starting to see some of this, particularly last year in 2013, projects out in places like western Kansas and Oklahoma were coming in around $20 a megawatt hour. Now you guys are probably more interested in the how things work and how to fix them and how they operate. But just for perspective over time, you're seeing projects in the $60, $70 range was not uncommon. And so when you go to the windiest places in the country, you're going to have some of the cheapest power. And that translates into, if you think about it in a different way, $20 is the same as 2 cents a kilowatt hour. And we pay, if you're a customer of Pinnacle, you're probably paying retail rate now, probably 10, 11, 12 cents. Okay? Now that's the cost of running their operation and so forth. But what it tells you, it gives you a sense of how cheap wind energy has come. This is an example of, for our project, the Great Belt Express, can tap wind energy in the range of $20 to $25 a megawatt hour. And then our transmission tariff cost is another $20. So that's to get it from western Kansas around Dodge City to eastern Missouri, as well as Illinois and Indiana. So that's another $20 or 2 cents. So a delivered price of 4.5 cents kW. That's the next slide shows you how that stacks up against other forms of generation. So I mentioned we're in the $20-some range. About $28 plus the transmission puts us just over $40. And we're actually seeing this come down from the time we built this or made the slide. The cost of wind has come down from 25 to closer to $20. So wind with a production tax credit about 26 bucks, or $48 without. Now in the and that's in the high wind places, so places like Kansas, a little bit more, right? So if you're trying to build wind in Indiana or you're trying to build it in New England, it's going to be more because the wind resource. So then you have combined cycle natural gas. Right now, wind with production tax credit or without is cheaper than combined cycle gas. Nuclear's probably north of $100. And coal technologies are also up there given the emissions technology they need to have. And solar's come down dramatically, but still not as low as say wind is. So this is why we are doing what we're doing. There's a supply and there's a demand for this, but there's a problem with getting the power to market. So here's the wind map, right? What these circles show are different regional grids. So we're in the Southwest Power Pool here, all of Kansas and sort of parts of Missouri, the western parts of Missouri. That's sort of in the middle. They all work together. They kind of operate their grid, all the utilities from Nebraska down through Oklahoma into Arkansas and Missouri. They all get together and say, all right, how do we operate our system to make it the most efficient? What resources to dispatch, how to utilize our transmission grid, and those kind of things. And when we need more transmission, we all, as ratepayers in the Southwest Power Pool, chip in and pay through our utility bill to build these projects. So they've recently started building projects within their footprint, because that's really the only way they can pay for them. We're all part of that power pool. And then in Texas, they have their own, they operate their own grid. That's called ERCOT. And they're building their own transmission lines to get the wind to market. Same thing in Southwest Power Pool up in the upper Midwest, where that's the MISO, Mid-Continent Interconnection, something or other, right? MISO. So they're working together to build transmission of their own. And there's more of them as you go east. But what they're not doing is trying to move power from one area to another, or from west to east. They have their own little fiefdom, okay? They have their ability to charge folks to build transmission, but they don't have the ability to charge folks out east to build them an extension cord. So that's why, when someone says, well, why can't the utilities do that? Why can't, KCP&L or, Westar or Ameren or someone just do that themselves? Well, you don't have a way to recover the cost, number one, and that's not really their business model. Their business model is to serve their local customers with cheap, reliable power. Okay, so they're not in the business of doing what we're doing. So we have 4 projects that we're working on. One out west, project I work on, the Grain Belt Express, the Rock Island Clean Line, and the Plains and Eastern Clean Line. As you can see, they all originate in that purple wind, and they try and get it to distant demand centers. Obviously, the obvious one is Southern California. The Plains and Eastern is from the Panhandle into TVA, the southeast, where there's really not much of a wind resource. The project I lead is the Grain Belt Express Clean Line from western Kansas into Missouri and all the way over to the Illinois-Indiana border. What that does is it connects you to this robust 765 kV grid that gets you all the way through, into the East Coast. So we have that one, and then of course Rock Island project from Iowa into the Chicago area. All these lines are same technology, direct current DC lines trying to move wind from the middle of the country to the east. So high voltage direct current, why are we using this? Isn't most of the grid alternating current? Yes, it is. Alternating current has worked well for what we have historically tried to do with our grid or utility, which is centralized power plant, within a territory that a utility serves, and they extend out from there on an AC system. AC alternating current works well because you can transform from higher, lower voltages up and down relatively easy. So if you're going short distances, that works very well. You can put it on a 345 kV line, run it 100 miles, to where you need to go, step it down, and that's fine. Or maybe less than that, 50, 60 miles. With direct current, of course, you need converter stations, to convert DC and then back. Those make sense when you're going long distance. So there's examples of this in other parts of the country where we use direct current. In fact, if I go back, we use DC in the U.S. and around the world for long-haul applications of large amounts of power. So this is a direct current line from the northwest bringing hydropower down into LA. There's a DC line from North Dakota down into the upper Midwest. And there's a DC line from Canada down into New England. And there are a couple of smaller projects going underwater to Long Island. The Bay Area has those as well. And then if you look around the country, particularly Europe and especially in Asia, DC is widely used because all the people live on the coast and all the resources, whether it be coal, hydro, or whatever, are inland. And so direct current allows you to move a large amount of power long distance with fewer line losses. So we're at 600 kV, 600 kilovolt for these lines, which higher the voltage, the lower the line losses, of course. It allows you to have controllability over the power flow. So as I mentioned, you're going to have a converter on one end, convert it to DC, direct current, move it down the line, and convert it back. Now those converter stations are controlled. They have ability to do certain technical things. By the way, I'm not a technical guy. I'm a developer, right? So I act like I know what I'm talking about when it comes to technical stuff. You just heard all I know about it. But we do know that when you put power onto the AC grid, it just goes. We don't count electrons or track them or know where they go. It just doesn't work, right? So with DC, it's different. There's a flow to it, and you can have more control over it. So that is good for our commercial structure because we're trying to sell to independent or individual consumers of this. So if I put it on the AC system, obviously it just kind of flows out, and you get to buy all these transmission service, around the country, and it's just not going to be cost effective. The other thing is this DC line is going to have a smaller footprint as trying to do this with AC, because I can put 3,500 megawatts on a single direct current transmission line. So to give you an example, the largest lines that we have around here in the Southwest Power Pool are 345 kV lines. And those could probably carry, 1,000, 1,500 megawatts, you know, depending on the rating. But we can do 3,500 megawatts on a single transmission line. So you're having to build fewer structures, which means you have a lower cost. Again, when I say large amount of power, long distance, this is why we're using it. And then you don't have delivery along the way. You don't necessarily tap a DC line because you need to have a converter station at these locations. So it all gets collected in western Kansas. There'll be a converter in eastern Missouri to serve Missouri, and then another final converter in the border of Illinois and Indiana. Okay. This is sort of a map that shows, you know, the Dodge City area, kind of our route in Kansas is defined. We kind of go up, you know, south of St. Joe, come across Missouri, have a converter over on the eastern end, like I said, to serve Missouri customers, and then continue on south of Terre Haute, Indiana. The project schedule here, you know, shows that, you know, we started this project in 2011, and by the way, there's no model for what we're doing. We're making this up as we go because, as I mentioned, the utilities aren't in this business. They don't know this. You know, they're just not designed to do this. So you can imagine the regulatory construct here is a little bit challenging. Now, if I were building a gas pipeline from Kansas to Indiana, I would go to FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and ask for an interstate permit. And I would do an environmental study and all the different things, filings, and they'd issue me a permit, and I have the siting authority to go build that line. It's all about them. This is why those can be built easily. Not so with electric transmission. They're regulated at the state level, which means I got to go to Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and get all of them to give me the approval to build this line. And I got to prove myself every single time, the benefits, the costs, the how we'll finance, construct, build, and all this each and every time. So that's why our timeline takes so long just to develop. But our goal is to have all this regulatory component ready by 2016 timeframe, and construction will be about a 2.5 year process. So by 2018, we can have it energized. Okay, so we're working. We're trying to go fast. We want to make jobs and get people to work on this stuff. But, we got to slug our way through the regulatory process.
Who's the worst?
What's that?
Who's the worst to deal with?
I'm not to plead the fifth on that because it might incriminate me.
Kansas?
No. Okay, so Kansas, we have our approval. There's a lot from Kansas, so I can say that there's a lot of things we don't do well, but siting transmission lines is not one of them. We got our route approved, and they have a process that allows you 120 days to get your order.
That's amazing.
Yeah, we got it done.
The most difficult one.
Well, we got that because typically that process is designed for utilities, and they help shape that whole process, and we were able to come in and use it. Or Missouri, for example, they don't have a transmission siting process at all. If you're KCP&L, you have your service territory, and you're allowed to go out and build whatever you need to build, as long as that's in your territory. And so they can build, and they don't have to go to the commission there. And so we're obviously not a utility with service territory, so what do? So we're having to make that up basically as we go. And so we're hoping to file here in Missouri, or we are going to file at the end of March and start that whole process. So that was a little bit trickier. We got our approval in Indiana, but granted, it's about 2 miles. So Missouri and Illinois. And Illinois is also, has its challenges too. It's it's a very complex state in terms of the political dynamics and the climate. The utilities there have, their own history with regulations. They used to be fully regulated. Now they're somewhat not regulated. So it's pretty tricky too. Our sister project, Rock Island, is going through that right now. And if we're lucky, we get a decision over the course of a 1.5 years. It might take 2 years. So time is a challenge for us. Yeah.
Mark, I was curious, what is the transmission tower height on these versus your typical 360 kV line?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are going to be a little bit bigger. I have a slide I have an appendix, depending on the questions I get asked, I can show you here, that talks about there. It'll be a little bit taller, so anywhere between 110 to 140 feet. Okay. So a little bit larger than like a 345 line, but about the same as if you've seen a 765 kV line or 500 kV line.
Does this typically make this a little bit more palatable to the public, you know, that it's DC because you don't have the electromagnetic radiation?
Yeah, I mean, well, you would hope and you would think so, but not always, because people have to educate themselves on the differences between AC and DC, and it's not always intuitive. And there's also a lot of misconception or misinformation about potential health impacts of electro and magnetic fields. You look at the science and literature, we've studied this for decades around the world, and there are no studies that say that this results in any sort of health impact. And they haven't just studied people living in transmission lines. What they've done is they've studied people that work in industrial settings where the electric and magnetic waves are much, much higher than what you would experience standing underneath one of these lines. So they took it to the extreme, and they looked at those people that work in those conditions, and they didn't find any correlation. But if you're concerned about it, or if you're not really, you don't want to have transmission lines around, you may not be inclined to believe those studies, right? We see that effect happening sometimes too, where folks will say, well, you can't prove that it doesn't. And they're asking me to prove a negative, which, how do you do that? So that's always a challenge, and obviously siting transmission lines is not easy from a public interaction standpoint. There are people that are happy to get paid for the easement. There are some people that don't want them, don't want to see them. And we're kind of at a point this is sort of a critical point in our industry, as our more really as a country, as we realize that our grid is under built. We built most of our grid in the 50s, right? And we haven't really invested in any appreciable way ever since then. So we have a 60-year-old grid that's fallen apart and doesn't do what we're asking it to do today. So everybody is on the same page. We got to improve this thing. We got to beef it up. We got to get smarter. We got to, build lines like these that move cheap energy to market. But you got to put the line somewhere, right? And that's where the rubber hits the road. So a lot of states are struggling right now. They have, they might have a significant amount of opposition because folks say, no, I don't want it. But we all agree that this needs to be done. So we kind of are at this point where regulators that make these decisions, are put in a position like, are we going to stop building our grid and improve, having reliable energy because folks don't want to look at it? That's the heart of the question, right? And but it's important, and I'm going to have some slides on this. Our approach to interaction with landowners is very unique. We spent years doing the routing process before we ever went to the state, getting feedback and helping people understand the issues. And that's not typical. Usually if you're a utility and you have the right to build a line wherever you want, why would you bother, right? Draw a straight line from A to B, and you go build it. Well, that's not really palatable today, right? You got to do a better job than that. And that's the good thing about being an independent company is that we can kind of break the mold and do it in a way that's more inclusive of people's concerns and issues and educate them. Is there an issue with EMF? Okay, well here's the body of science. Let's walk people through it and inform them. Okay, so just a high level of what this project is. I've kind of hit on a lot of this, but Western Kansas, 3,500 megawatts wind farms, all sort of concentrated around southwest Kansas, where the best of the best wind is. 8 to 9 meters a second wind delivered into the eastern states. Okay. I mentioned we got approval in Kansas and Indiana. We're going to file in Missouri here in about a month. We'll be delivering into MISO and also to PJM. So that gets you to all the way to New Jersey, Maryland. Okay. And we're in the process of doing our routing and outreach in Missouri and soon to be Illinois. So as I was talking about the routing, okay, here are all the issues that we have to look at when it comes to, thanks for coming guys.
Thank you.
Yeah. there's a whole slew of constraints. There's a whole slew of opportunities when it comes to siting the line. We were just talking beforehand. Well, why don't you put these down the rail right away, right? You know, a lot of abandoned railroads out there. You know, maybe along the highway. These are great ideas, and we look at all of them. What we found with transmission, our Rock Island project, is something that we actually acquired parts of the easement of the old Rock Island Railroad when we started this project. But we learned a lot. So one thing we learned is that transmission lines like to be straight, but railroads follow topography and they wind and curve. The reason that's important is every time you put an angle on a transmission line, you create stress. You know, you want to have a tangent, okay? But otherwise, you have to overbuild the structure to hold those lines up. So you're constantly doing angled structures, and that cost goes through the roof. You'd be sort of amazed at how much so. And then, of course, your towns that have developed along the railroads historically, right? So, the interesting fact of what I learned is that you know the old steam engines had to actually refill with water every 12 or 15 miles. And so that's why you had a town about that so often as you go through the country. So that creates a radical, because now you're going around each town, you're going around. Before long, you're not really following that railroad. Okay, you're not using that opportunity. What we do find useful are other transmission lines. You know, those ones that are built in the 50s that are straight, those are good. But next to that, there's already a transmission line there. Okay, so we do that a lot. Maybe even pipelines. There's already linear infrastructure there, so it makes sense to utilize that land use for a similar purpose. And property boundaries, right? You get poles out of the middle of people's farm fields.